Caroline is going to talk to us. So we kind of prompted her with, you'll see on your program, critical threads about contemporary art. But what she later told us is she would really like to talk about her relationship with William, her working relationship with William, and all the projects and the various journeys that they took in this working relationship. So that's really going to form the beginning part. And William, we briefly chatted to Caroline yesterday, who said that she's going to tell her version, and hopefully you can corroborate. So we'll hear exactly what she has to say, and kind of William can feedback. Tandazani does also have some input from there. Caroline Christov-Bakargiev is a curator, researcher, and scholar. She was recently part of William Kentridge in conversation with Caroline Christov-Bakargiev at the British School in Rome, and is the author of William Kentridge, an extensive monograph on the artist's work. If you would like to page through it, we actually have that in our reading room on level 3 as part of the exhibition. She is director of Castello di Rivoli, Museo Arte Contemporanea, and of Fondazione Francesco Federico Cerruti. She holds a visiting professorship at Northwestern University and has taught at the University of Leeds, at the Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main, and at Harvard University. Christov-Bakargiev was born in the United States from a Bulgarian father and an Italian mother, and she returned to Italy to conduct her studies in literature and philosophy at the universities of Genoa and Pisa. She began her career in the arts, writing reviews for the magazine Reporter and for the newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore. Following a period at Villa Medici, where she curated summer exhibitions from 1998 to 2000, she served as chief curator at PS1 Contemporary Art Center, affiliated to MoMA in New York. Amongst many other projects at PS1, she organized the groundbreaking survey of Janet Cardiff's work. In 2002, she returned to Turin to work at Castello di Rivoli upon invitation of its former director. In 2008, she curated the Sydney Biennale, followed by Documenta 13 in 2012, and the 14th Istanbul Biennale in 2015. The following year, she returned to Turin, where until 2017, she directed both GAM and Castello di Rivoli. Amongst her major publications is the monograph Art Povera. We welcome Koyo over Skype. We welcome Carolyn over Skype.
Good morning, Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn.
Good morning. Good morning.
As you can see, I'm seated here with William, and we're excited to hear your keynote address and the conversation that will follow.
I'd like to thank all of you for the invitation. It's wonderful, and everything related to William Kentridge's work is very inspiring. Is the concept of the keynote address is a very complicated concept because it suggests the importance of one address over other addresses. So it somehow the speaking possibilities. So I prefer to consider it a notes address than a keynote address. That said, it's a rare thing for someone who's in the curatorial business to speak about the behind the scenes of the intimacy of working with an artist. It's not what is done. It reverses what is usually done, which is that it's about the artist. Whereas I was intrigued by the description of what I should speak. I the invitation. I'd like to say everything is somehow wrote giving this talk. The gods are against it because on Friday and all of last, actually Thursday before, there were torrential rains in Pite, and I'd like the audience there to know that torrential rains have not only damaged some of the roofs, the Castello di Rivoli, which brought me to the decision to not travel, be there in the flesh with you, but take it up with the technology. But also, some people died also from floods in nearby town in Alexandria. So these freak storms which are far increased that seem to be, or they are connected with climate change. And I'm not a biologist, I don't know, but it would seem that the Furies, like in a Greek play, have been furious. The other problem of the delay this morning, I'd like to share with the audience, is due to the fact that although we tested the Skype yesterday, and we were at the same time, the synchronized time that William and I have often discussed as being the colonial time, the time organization of time, since the 1800s, with the Greenwich Mean Time and all the times being laid out to mobilize the globe. Last night, Italy checked the time. I just found out from a message. At 3 a.m., between yesterday and today, this was shifted 1 hour. So, another paradox, because it's one of the subjects of at least one, if not more works, I have touched on this issue of the standardization of time and its relation to modernity and its relation with power. So again, it's a kind of historical nemesis, a nemesis that gets even with the Skype, the address or the keynote address to actually occur in a synchronized way. So that delay of this morning. Now that preamble brings me to tell you that I woke up this morning with a word that I thought should not be used, since we are talking about what somehow should be said, because it's about the question of empathy. I thought it was a word we should not speak about totally, but it may be something related to what occurs in the relationship between the world and myself and the relationship between the world and William. But because it is not tremendously ethical to speak about empathy, I prefer to not speak about that. And I spent some time yesterday and the days before thinking about where I met William, trying to remember where I met William. If it was in his house in 1997, when the when the second Johannesburg Biennial opened, which was from October 12th to the 12th of December, and it was made by Uckwick and Whitver, or not. And then I thought that there was something before that which had happened. And what had happened was that I had seen the video Mine, made in 1991, one of the Soho Eckstein and Felix Teitelbaum works. I had seen it in a small alternative space in Rome, in a space called Sala Uno, directed by a woman called Mariangela Schroff, on the occasion of a group exhibition of art from South Africa, curated by an artist called Sue Williamson. I didn't know William, and I remember being very shocked by this small monitor, the plinth, in a corner, in a very low-key way, showing this drilling into the earth, where the destruction of the earth corresponded to the destruction also of bodies. And I was working on an exhibition called Città Natura, City Nature, which was looking at the contradictions between urban life and rural life, and decided to include this video. And without knowing William, this video was exhibited in Villa Mazzanti, which is a formerly domestic house in the middle of the gardens on the edge of town in Rome. And this was the only video cassette that was stolen during the exhibition. So the floods of last week, the Skype connection, the stealing of the video cassette, all this marks the beginnings of a very long relationship. Now, at that time, that was spring 1997, at that time, early spring 1997, at that time, I was working, I had just installed, and getting to a point which I hope is actually of some interest to others. I was in the middle of touring one of the first retrospectives of an artist that I had worked on. He had just died in 1995, and his name was Alberto Burri. And my daughter had just died in 1995. So the making of this exhibition of Alberto Burri was somehow a healing period where I entered very meticulously into the details of the life of Alberto Burri. And this exhibition of Alberto Burri was held at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels at the end of 1996 and the beginning of 1997. And I believe that this overlapping of interest for William's mind and the working on the exhibition of Burri led actually to the, as randomness does, out of randomness comes sometimes the most important things. This cosmic connection brought to the beginning of working with William, because a man called Pete Cousins, who was the director of the Palais des Beaux-Arts, he felt intuitively that I was the right person to work on what would be the first exhibition in Europe, public exhibition in a museum in Europe, which ultimately ended up opening in 1998. From the 15th of May to the 23rd of August at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, and which toured to the MOCAA in Barcelona and to the Serpentine in London, and then I believe maybe also to Marseille. So what is the relationship with Burri? Burri had been maybe even a fascist. He was a young man and a doctor. He was a medical doctor. And he was drafted during World War II. And he spent time in a prison camp in Texas. And in Texas, he decided to stop being a medical doctor and to start to make art. And his first paintings were these little, very traditional oil paintings of the landscape in Texas, more or less not far from where Donald Judd has his fantastic house and studio and foundation. And the intense colors of the landscape in Texas may have reminded Burri also of the area in North Africa where he had been drafted to and where he became prisoner of war. And he left the world in the way of humans. And he decided that he would, after the war, proceed through some sort of a very solitary existential avenue of working on the healing of materials. So he began to use burlap sacks and to suture them. These burlap sacks were the Marshall Plan. That meant bringing money and wealth and investment back to Europe after World War II. So the torn and sutured bags of burri had to do with trauma. And it had to do, in my mind, with the contradictions between art and power as well. Even the personal contradictions between art and power. What does it mean to grow up in a fascist regime, to be drafted and to fight with fascists, and at the same time to somehow be thrown into it in the way that Heidegger speaks of, Geworfenheit, of being thrown into the world and its contradictions. Now, I believe that Pete Cousins is the most important absent person here today, because Pete felt that I was the right person. I had never met William, so it doesn't go through a normal curatorial avenue of I'm interested in this artist and I ask for an appointment and I want to meet. Even though there is freak mine cassette that got stolen, and that had happened nonetheless, like somehow a strange clue or contradiction in this narrative of coincidence that I'm trying to tell. So the narrative of coincidence is that Pete thought that I was the only person in Europe who could write that book, or a right person. And so he invited me. That's how we were thrown together. And I believe that probably the relationship with the body of materials that one uses, the charcoal, which is nothing other than a freak mistake of nature, because charcoal is the fruit of trees and plants millions of years ago, having been captured under lava. And therefore, the normal cycle that gives us oxygen to breathe from the trees. And Africa is now giving the oxygen to the whole planet for us to breathe, because that's the reality, Brazil and Africa. This freak event of 3 million years ago, which covered some trees in certain parts of the world, produced this putrefaction, which produces peat, which produces oil, but it also, if you burn the tree, produces just your charcoal with which you draw. So this becoming responsible for the material that one uses, becoming aware of the material which one uses, that if you draw on a paper, you're actually erasing or you're scratching onto the surface of the paper. And what that implies, and the relationship between this individual gesture and the cosmic relations, and in between those two, the political relations, is what probably drew me to put together that book. And basically, from the putting together of the book, I believe came also the choices of the works and the layout of the works in the exhibition that was curated actually by Pete Cousins. But the making of the book and the making of the exhibition became very intertwined. Now, I think that I mentioned this death of the child. Now, William, of course, is he's a white man, and he's in South Africa, and that's quite a difficult position also to be in, because he's also of Jewish descent. So the relationship with the Holocaust, even though one has lived far from where those events occurred, has much to do with a kind of survivor syndrome. Now, the survivor syndrome is the syndrome that a mother has if the child has died. So I believe that our lives, we are not such a different age. I believe that our lives are somehow, although we never speak about it, I don't think we've ever spoken about it, also connect on the level of a certain sense of guilt, of simply being alive on the planet rather than dead. And I believe that this brings me to the punchline of what I wanted to say, and then I will tell you what we did together. But just in case this Skype connection falls, I want to get the punchline in. So the punchline is that what I think we share, without having it spoken, because these are things that you do not speak unless you are asked to speak them, is that we believe, I think, and I asked William what he thinks of this. I think that we maybe think both, that art is important because it makes us understand, and it makes people understand why life is more important than art. That's the point. So it has to do with a fundamental displacement. If art is important because it makes you understand why life is more important than art, it means that you are working on a displacement. The displacement is constantly on a technical perspective in William's mind. He works in theater and in scenography and in images that are projected. So he's constantly thinking about how the projector will work, how the mirror will work, how things can go in one direction and end up in another direction with a mirror, for example. So the question of displacement is fundamental, is a consequence of that condition I just described. And it is at the birth of William's work, because if you think of the title Drawings for Projection, it means that the drawing is not important. The drawing is not for work because it is for a projection. But at the same time, it means that the projection is not important because it is for somehow the drawing that will make it. So you're hovering in an interspace where both elements are pointing to the other element. One is just documentation of the process of the making of the film. The film is just documentation of the making of the drawing. So when I understood that William was working in this gray zone, this zone of the shadow as opposed to the zone of the object, the zone of the displacement, the zone of the oblique gaze and not the direct gaze, the zone of uncertainty, I understood I had finally found a post-feminist male artist. And I remember that in my essay, in that book, in a footnote, I slipped in a sentence from Bracha Ettinger on the concept of the matrixio. And I remember William asking me, what the hell does that footnote mean? And I tried to explain what the matrixio was. And the matrixio was the first confutation of Freud. Freud's idea that birth is a trauma, that there's a before birth and there's an after birth, and that the birth is a trauma. I tried to explain to him that Bracha said that Freud was a male and that he had not given birth. He had not given birth. So how could he understand that there was a whole gray area that lasted for so long, which was the time before when you're pregnant with the not yet mother and the not yet child. And the not yet mother and the not yet child lasted for so long after the birth. So there had needed to be a woman, psychoanalyst, to frame this concept of the gray zones of the transition.
Caroline, talk closer to the phone. Just talk closer to the phone.
Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. We're trying to talk to each other through all these things. It almost looks like one of those videos, like where all the wires, of the telephones are Hello? 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 Do you hear me?
No,
Well, the good thing, you don't hear me?
hardly.
Hello?
Hardly.
Well, that means that the technology wants us to stop. I can say it reminds me.
Turn your phone upside down. Turn your phone upside down. Yes?
How about that?
Better.
Does it work? Okay. No, as you know, technology of communication is one of the most typical topics that come up in William's work. So I've actually staged this whole thing. The flood rains, the water coming in, the Skype not working, the WhatsApp not working. Anyway, so I tried to explain to William what trick still meant. And I'm not sure I ever was able to achieve that. So I spent the last 25 years trying to explain that to William, that he was a post-feminist male artist. But I don't believe that has ever really come fully across. For me, thinkers like Edie Garay or Lissinger, who mentioned, or Judith Butler, or Eva, or Hannah Arendt are very important. I think maybe only the Hannah Arendt has somehow connected with William, but that's a lot, because Hannah Arendt positions the space of us talking as a fundamental space. So it's already quite a lot. I mean, even though I cannot reach to convince William of the question of the intelligence of plants and how we communicate with plants, it's okay. I think it's enough. You know, what we've achieved is enough in this dialogue. So we ended up, the last thing I want to say before passing on is that I had a plan here, of speaking about all the works. Because what we did, I cannot remember what the new work was in the Brussels exhibition or in Serpentine. I do remember that when it went to MOCAA was the first time William did a shadow procession on the outside of the MOCAA building. So it was the beginning of thinking about shadows in a very direct way. And as you know, Baxendal had just, Michael Baxendal had just published his book on the relationship between shadows and light and the Enlightenment, the term Enlightenment, and the idea that light is knowledge in the Enlightenment in 1997. So Shadow Procession that comes out in 1999 is somehow coming from talking about this issue of the shadows. Although if you listen to a lecture by William, he will not speak about Baxendal, but he will speak about Plato, and he will speak about the cave and how the shadows in the Plato. I should stop speaking? Okay, I should wrap it up. Okay, so
No, my dear, you can
we
just
already
wrap
gave
it
the
up.
punchline, so that's wrapped up. But what we did together was sleeping on glass, and then the stair procession at PS1, and then tight table in Castello di Rivoli showed the Méliès fragments that he had also shown a month or two earlier with Lynn on an island in Sweden. And then in the Sydney Biennale, I Am Not Me and the Horse Is Not Mine. I was reading a lot about skepticism at the time and doubting, and he was reading about time and the question of globalization of time. And then we finally, in Istanbul, worked together, and Oh Sentimental Machine came out, that in the hotel lobby, which had to do with Trotsky and being remote and being in the world and also remote at the same time. And then finally, there is the procession of reparationists here in Torino in an old car repair factory, which should arrive at Castello very soon. It's still downtown, sadly. Okay, thank you.
Carolyn, maybe, so we had wanted the audience to ask questions, but because of because we started quite late because of the technical issues, we'll let William respond a little bit to some of what you said. We do have a 2-hour lunch, so I think we'll be okay. But is it okay if we take this moment to let William respond to you?
Yes.
Caroline, hello. So the thing which is, you always have things to say which I've never thought of, some of which I don't understand, like matrixial. That's a nice lifetime project to try to understand that. But what you say about displacement and avoiding the question and the transformation of questions about the world into questions of what one does in the studio, I think puts very clearly what I've always felt but have never articulated in so many terms. So I've always thought, well, what is it that if I'm drawing a line, it can't just be a line, it also has to be a shoulder in the world or something like that. You put it so clearly, the idea of making art to show that life is more important than art. And the only way to do that is to be completely dedicated to that process and practice of art making. And I've always thought, well, what is the strangeness of the one hand saying my work is in the studio, and that's the only thing I can really do is do the work in the studio. But I think it is because of the larger question that you raise, because of what that can show us of things outside of the studio. So for that clarity of placing that question of displacement, avoiding the question, and of course as a white South African, the question of what is the relationship to guilt, to responsibility, to historical responsibility, to personal connection. Those are obviously the soup in which we swim here. Even though one may not, feel the soup all around you, that's absolutely where we are and where the work comes from. So, just from my side, thank you so much for that clarity of the punchline, as you call it. And I think it's a very good punchline for us to, or for me certainly, to think about during the course of the other deliberations today and when I talk later this evening. And I would say what a pleasure it has been these 20 years working on these many, many projects. And I think, to correct you, our first meeting was in fact at a residency at Civitella Ranieri in Umbria.
Yes.
Where I was making drawings and you were there with Cesare, and Cesare was organizing his archive of photographs. And gradually, through the lunches, through the suppers, and through coming into seeing what was happening in the studio, that was where a connection came. So it was a kind of fortuitous connection, and then it became one more connection when we did the first project together. And then I remember after the second project, you said, well, this has been very nice meeting you, but you understand that curators can't keep working with the same artist, so we won't work together again. And I was a little bit taken aback. I thought, I've waited all these years to find a curator to work with like this, and I'm told this is the end. And I'm so happy that you weren't able to keep your word. And that each project, and I also remember very clearly an understanding of what it is that a great curator does. And that is that it's both a response to the work, but it's always a provocation. Saying, yes, I know you've done that work, and that's lovely, but really, let's do something completely different and something completely more out on a limb than you've done before each time. And so the work is always done in twofold in terms of the best curating. It's both done for an ongoing series of projects in the studio, but it's also done in response to the wish of a curator. Not the wish is the wrong thing. It's not even the need. It's the energy that comes from the curator of wanting a new project to be there in the world. That's both a connection to an interest you have as a curator and something that's cooking in the studio already, both of those processes. And as you've listed, there have been by now 10 or 12 different projects that we've done over the period, and for that, a big thank you from my part. And I'm sorry about the flood in your museum. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, you see, the mind is such a strange thing, because I spent many days trying to remember where we had met. Now, William mentioned this residency in Civitella Raniera. Now, I can tell you, and he mentions Cesare, my husband, who had the residency as well. But I have to say that there's something from my perspective as well that folds into the story I told you, which is connected with that residency. It's more or less the first time I left home after having a child. Her name is Rosa, who was born 1 year after the death of Sofia. So it's before the opening of the Burri show. She was 1 month old in Civitella Ranieri, which positions Civitella Ranieri at about end of June or July, early July 1996. So the freak connection is still there, because I believe that the Sue Williamson exhibition, when I didn't know, hadn't met you, was in the spring of 96. So still, there is this question of entanglement and what appears as coincidences, but might just be the universe which is folded in a complicated way.
And the other thing I know that you once wanted me to understand was why an asteroid should have a vote in an election. And that now makes much more sense to me.
It's very easy, you know, to give the vote to asteroids. It's a question of representation and proportional through the scientists of the stones. You know, we don't have a weighed form of democracy yet. We're still working with a form of democracy that was invented by the damn Enlightenment.
So these are conversations to be continued in the years ahead. Thank you.
Bye, Carolyn. Thank you so much.
No questions from the audience? No? No. Okay, bye. Thank you so much. Bye, 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 bye.